Hunters understand risk differently than most wilderness users. This is not a criticism. It is an observation about the specific relationship that develops between a person and a landscape when that person has spent years moving through it in pursuit of something that requires full attention and complete presence. Hunters learn terrain the way soldiers learn terrain. Not aesthetically, not recreationally, but functionally, in the way that competence and survival demand. They know where the game trails cross the ridge lines. They know where the wind shifts at altitude. They know the specific quality of morning light on the eastern faces and what it means for movement and visibility. The two men who disappeared in the Wyoming backcountry in early October had been hunting together for 11 years. They had met in their 20s in a way that hunting friendships often form, through a mutual acquaintance in the field on a day when one of them was struggling with a situation and the other had the knowledge to help. They had hunted elk and mule deer across 3 western states. They had been in bad weather together, in difficult terrain together, in the kind of situations that reveal a person's character in ways that ordinary social life does not. They trusted each other completely. This is worth establishing, because what followed cannot be understood without understanding the quality of that trust. These were not men who would separate carelessly. They were not men who would fail to maintain communication in difficult terrain. They had protocols they had developed over years, specific distances, specific signals, specific intervals at which they checked in with each other. The last time they were seen together was at 6:20 in the morning, leaving their base camp. The older of the two was 51. He was the one who would eventually come back. The younger was 38. He was the one who would not. The Wyoming backcountry in early October has a specific character. The high summer grasses have gone dry and golden. The aspen stands have turned, not the tentative yellowing of early September, but the full, deep gold of peak color, the kind that makes the mountain landscape look lit from within. The air at altitude is cold at night, sometimes well below freezing, and warm enough in the afternoon to make the sun feel generous. The game is moving. The rut is approaching. The mountains feel, in this season, more actively inhabited than at any other time of year. The terrain they were hunting was high country, above the tree line in places, with dense timber in the drainages and open meadows on the upper slopes. They had hunted this specific drainage before, though not for several years. The older man knew it better than the younger. He had hunted elk there in his 30s and remembered the specific benchlands where the bulls bedded in the mornings and the springs where they watered in the afternoon. They had a specific plan for the day. The younger man would work the lower timber, pushing uphill slowly, while the older man circled to the upper meadows and waited. It was a standard elk hunting technique. It required both of them to hold their positions at appointed times and to signal by radio, by whistle, by the specific calls they had developed over years when they were moving. By midday, the older man was at his position on the upper meadow. He had not heard from his partner since 8 in the morning. He waited. This is what experienced hunters do when communication breaks down. They wait. The terrain in these drainages absorbs sound in unpredictable ways. Radios lose signal between ridgelines. A man pushing slowly through dense timber makes little noise and receives little signal. He assumed his partner was still working his way up. He glassed the timber below him. He watched the drainage. By 1 in the afternoon, he began moving. He worked back down through the timber the way his partner should have come, slowly, calling, stopping to listen. He reached the areas where the younger man should have been by mid-morning. He found no sign. Boot tracks in the muddy soil near a stream crossing indicated that his partner had been there, moving uphill at some point in the morning. The tracks continued for perhaps 50 meters and then transitioned to drier ground where they became invisible. He searched the surrounding terrain for the remainder of the afternoon. He called. He used the whistle pattern they had established. No response. He walked back to base camp before dark, moving quickly. He was hoping his partner had returned by a different route, had circled back for some reason he hadn't communicated. This happens sometimes in hunting, a change of plan, a sighting that drew you in a different direction, a route that made more sense in the moment than the planned one. His partner was not at base camp. He drove out to the nearest phone and called the sheriff's office at 7:15 in the evening. The search began the following morning. Wyoming game wardens and county search and rescue personnel worked the drainage systematically from both ends. They were experienced in this terrain. Several of the SAR team members had hunted this specific area themselves. They knew the likely routes, the natural traps, the places where a hunter moving quickly could make a navigation error in heavy timber. The older man guided them through the terrain he had covered himself. He walked them to the muddy stream crossing where he had found his partner's boot tracks. The tracks were confirmed. A team was assigned to work uphill from that point, tracking any continuation on soft ground. They found additional boot tracks approximately a quarter mile above the stream crossing. The tracks moved through a small meadow and into the timber on the far side. They became intermittent. The timber floor was dry and hard, but the direction of travel was clear. And then the direction of travel stopped making sense. The tracks, where they could be followed, led toward a specific feature, a dense cluster of large boulders on the upper edge of the timber, where the forest transitioned to the rocky subalpine zone. The trackers noted this and moved carefully through the boulder cluster, looking for where the tracks continued on the far side. They did not continue on the far side. There were no tracks emerging from the boulder cluster in any direction. The soil on the uphill edge, where the terrain became more exposed and the ground softer again, showed no boot prints. The experienced tracker leading the team circled the cluster twice, expanding his search radius on each pass. He found nothing. A man had walked into those boulders. He had not walked out. The search ran for 3 weeks, not 3 days, not 11 days, as in the Sierra Nevada case. 3 weeks. By the end of the first week, resources from 3 counties were involved. The state game and fish department had contributed personnel. 2 separate canine teams had been brought in. An aerial sweep with thermal imaging had been conducted across a grid that covered the entire drainage and the adjacent terrain. The older man remained at base camp through most of the search. He was questioned multiple times. Standard procedure in any disappearance, and particularly important in cases where the last known witness to the subject was a companion who had been separated from them. He cooperated fully. He answered every question. He walked the search teams through the terrain he had covered. He showed them the meadow where he had waited, the routes he had taken on his way back down. His account was consistent and credible. There was no serious suspicion of anything other than a terrible accident in difficult terrain. But no evidence of that accident was found. No body, no gear, no sign of a fall, no signal from his emergency locator beacon, which had not been triggered, which meant either that he had not been in a situation where he was able to trigger it, or that he had been in a situation where triggering it was not something he thought to do. The search teams worked the boulder cluster repeatedly. They probed the gaps between the rocks with poles. They sent small framed personnel into the spaces that were wide enough to enter. They used the dogs in and around the boulders, trying to find where the scent continued. The dogs behaved at the boulder cluster the way the dogs in the Pacific Northwest and the Sierra Nevada had behaved. They worked the perimeter. They did not enter the interior spaces. The lead handler described the behavior not as reluctance, but as a kind of orientation, as if the dogs were paying attention to the boulders rather than to the ground around them, as if the thing they were tracking was associated with the boulders themselves, rather than with a scent trail leading away from them. He filed this observation in his own notes. It did not appear in the official SAR record. On the 22nd day of the search, the older man was found, not by a search team. He walked out on his own, emerging from the timber on the far side of a ridgeline that had been searched on day 4. He was found by a hunter from a different party who was working a different drainage and encountered him sitting against a tree at the edge of a meadow. He was alive. He was confused about how much time had passed. He believed he had been in the field for 4 or 5 days. He was 40 miles from the boulder cluster. 40 miles in terrain that included 2 significant ridge lines, multiple stream crossings, and elevations ranging from 8,000 to nearly 12,000 feet. He had no memory of traveling that distance. His gear was intact. His body showed signs of physical exertion. He was dehydrated. He had lost weight. But nothing that corresponded to what 3 weeks in the Wyoming backcountry in October should do to a person. The weight loss was consistent with a few days of reduced caloric intake, not 3 weeks of exposure. The medical team that evaluated him noted that his core temperature was within normal range, that his extremities showed no signs of frostbite despite 3 weeks that had included multiple nights well below freezing, that the condition of his clothing and gear, worn but not destroyed, was inconsistent with prolonged exposure to the conditions he would have encountered if he had spent 3 weeks moving through that terrain. The physician who evaluated him wrote a single line in his notes that he did not include in the formal record. Subject's physical presentation is inconsistent with the stated duration of his disappearance. He did not elaborate in his notes. He did not need to. The line said everything. The interview with the older man was conducted in stages as his orientation improved over the 2 days following his recovery. He could describe his first hours clearly. Leaving base camp at 6:20. The plan. His partner going into the lower timber. His own movement toward the upper meadow. The waiting. The silence that grew as the morning progressed. The decision to go looking. He could describe finding his partner's tracks at the stream crossing. He could describe following them uphill And then he reached the boulder cluster. What he said about the boulder cluster across multiple conversations over several days as his cognition stabilized was consistent in its core, but difficult to construct into a linear narrative. He did not describe entering the boulders and coming out the other side and then traveling 40 miles. He described something that resisted the narrative structure of before and after. He said, "I was at the boulders. I was looking for him in there, and then I was somewhere else, not somewhere far, not a different landscape, somewhere else in the sense of a different quality of being in the same terrain. The mountains were the same mountains, the sky was the same sky, the timber below him was the same timber. But it was empty." He used that word specifically, empty. Not empty of people. He was there, whatever that meant in the context he was describing. Empty of what makes a landscape inhabited, not just human presence. The quality of being a world that is attended to. That is in use. He said, it was like being in the same place, but before it was real. He searched for his partner there. He moved through terrain that looked like the terrain he knew, calling his name, looking in the places where his partner might have gone. He did not find him. He described spending what felt like several days in that place. He described sleeping, eating from his pack, continuing to move and search. He described the silence as absolute and unbroken, not threatening, simply vast, as if the normal acoustic texture of a mountain wilderness, wind, birds, water, had been removed, leaving the landscape stripped to its essential form. He said, "I wasn't afraid. I want to be clear about that. I was looking for him. I was worried about him. But I wasn't afraid of where I was. It felt like somewhere I had the right to be. In some way, I couldn't explain. And then he was back. Not a transition he could describe. Not a door or a passage or a moment of shift. He was in the empty version of the terrain, and then he was in the real version of it, sitting against a tree at the edge of a meadow, not knowing how much time had passed. He has not returned to hunting. This was a decision that his wife says he made in the first weeks after the recovery, and that he has never revisited. Not with anguish, not with drama, as if it was simply a door he was no longer interested in opening. He still lives in Wyoming. He still spends time outdoors. He walks, he fishes. He is, by all external accounts, functional and present, and engaged with his life. But his wife, in a conversation with the researcher who eventually gathered the family's account, said that there was something different about how he inhabited the world now. Not a pathological difference. Not the flattened affect of someone in crisis. Not the hypervigilance of someone with untreated trauma. Something more subtle. She said it was like the way someone who has learned a foreign language well will sometimes pause briefly before they speak, as if they're deciding which language to use. She said, he pauses sometimes, in moments where he used to move through smoothly. And I don't know if he's remembering something or if he's checking something, but there's a pause that wasn't there before. The researcher asked if she knew what he was checking. She said, I think he's checking whether this is the real one. She said this quietly, not with fear, not as a sentence that required a response. As a fact she had arrived at over time that she was still getting used to. She said, I don't think it troubles him. I think he's just become someone who knows there's more than one. The younger man was never found. This is the sentence that the case ultimately reduces to, and it requires sitting with. 3 weeks of intensive search, multiple agencies, dogs, aircraft, ground teams, expanded grid. 40 years of combined SAR experience applied systematically to a drainage that should have yielded its secrets. It yielded nothing. No body, no gear, no remains, no evidence of a fall or an injury or a water crossing gone wrong. No signal from the locator beacon. No indication, in any form, that the physical world usually provides, that a person had come through that terrain and died there. He simply is not there. He is in the record as a missing person. The case is technically still open, as most unfound missing persons cases remain open. His family has continued to receive occasional communications from the sheriff's office as required by protocol. Communications that have nothing new to report. His hunting partner has visited his family twice since the recovery. The first visit was in the winter, following the search. The second was 3 years later. Both visits were, by all accounts, quiet and private, and not discussed in detail by anyone present. The older man has said, in the interview that the researcher conducted, that what he found hardest in the years following was the specific nature of the absence. He said, "When someone dies, there's a way the world adjusts. The absence takes a specific shape. It becomes part of how the world is." He said, "This is different. The absence doesn't have a shape. I don't know where he is. And part of what I experienced in that place, in whatever place that was, is that it was not empty of him in the way that an ordinary landscape would be empty of a person who was somewhere else." The researcher asked him to say more about that. He said, "It felt like somewhere he could be. It felt like the kind of place where someone could be, and you just hadn't found them yet." He said, I looked for days in there, whatever days means in that place. I didn't find him." He said, "I don't know if that means he wasn't there. I don't know if my looking was good enough. I don't know if there are parts of that place I didn't reach." He said this without falling apart. He said it with the specific steadiness of someone who has carried a weight long enough to know how to carry it. But his hands were clasped on the table when he said it, and the researcher did not ask anything more. The boulder cluster in the Wyoming drainage has not been formally studied. It is not identified by name on any map. It is a feature that experienced hunters in the area know in the way you know the specific character of terrain you've worked for years, not as a location with a designation, but as a place with a quality. Several hunters who were interviewed by the researcher for different aspects of this case without being led there used similar language about the boulder cluster specifically. One said, "That's a funny spot." When asked what he meant, he said, "You just don't like being in there. Something about it. You feel watched in there, but you can't see what's watching." Another, who had hunted the drainage for 22 years, said, "I've always given that spot a wide berth. My dog doesn't like it. He went in there once and came back with his tail down, and I've never been able to get him back near it since." He was asked if he had ever seen anything unusual in that area. He thought about it. He said, "Nothing I could point to, just a feeling. You know how some places feel wrong?" The researcher said, "Yes." The hunter said, "It feels wrong in there, has as long as I can remember." He said this in the matter-of-fact way of someone describing a fact about the landscape, the way you'd describe a bog that's hard to cross, or a face that's exposed to afternoon lightning. Practical information about a feature of the terrain. not something he was troubled by, something he knew. The specific geography of the Wyoming drainage deserves more time than a disappearance case usually gives it. This is not the dramatic wilderness of the Tetons or the Yellowstone Plateau, terrain that appears in photographs and is understood, even by people who have never been there, as spectacular and serious. This is working backcountry, high, cold, and without obvious features that draw attention to it. A drainage like dozens of others in the Wyoming high country, a valley carved by water and shaped by erosion into a form that is functional rather than picturesque. The timber in the lower drainage is lodgepole pine, dense and dark, growing in the tight packed stands that characterize post-fire regrowth. Lodgepole grows fast and straight and close together, and moving through a mature lodgepole forest requires a specific physical commitment. Not the openness of the high country, not the filtered light of old-growth forest, but a pressing closeness that gives you perhaps 20 meters of visibility and a continuous sense of working against the landscape rather than through it. Above the timber, the terrain opens into the subalpine. Willows along the drainages, open slopes of grass and forb, the scattered krummholz that marks the boundary between tree line and the exposed rock above. This is where the elk spend the October afternoons, grazing in the low light, visible from the ridges. This is the terrain that experienced hunters know how to read, and above that, the boulder fields, not unique to this drainage, not even particularly dramatic by Wyoming standards, not the massive tumbled granite of the Sierra, not the sheer cliff faces of the canyon country, just boulders, frost-heaved and lichen-covered, stacked into formations that create dark corridors and deep shadow spaces, and the specific quality of a landscape that has been arranged slowly over thousands of years of freeze and thaw into something that resembles deliberate architecture. The cluster at the upper edge of the timber had been there for a long time. The hunters who had worked this drainage over the years were aware of it. In the peripheral way you become aware of features in terrain you know well, not thinking about them directly, but knowing they are there, routing around them or through them depending on the situation, noting them the way you note any feature that has a quality worth remembering. The quality they noted was not dramatic, just, you don't linger there, just, the dogs don't like it, just, something about it. The kind of observation that experienced outdoors people make about specific terrain features and then carry forward as practical information, without necessarily knowing why the information feels important to carry. In the following episode, this series leaves the hunter's landscape and moves into a different kind of wilderness. The Appalachians, old mountains, the oldest mountains in North America, worn down by hundreds of millions of years of erosion into something rounded and forested and dense. The kind of landscape that feels inhabited in a way that the Sierra Nevada and the Wyoming backcountry do not inhabited by people, but inhabited, period. Full of its own presence, in a way that makes you feel sometimes that you are the guest here, rather than the explorer. A search and rescue team working an Appalachian disappearance brings trained tracking dogs to the last known position. The dogs stop. They stop at the same point, the same exact point, on 3 separate attempts by 3 separate handlers. The missing hiker is found 4 days later, on the other side of the point where the dogs stopped. with no memory of crossing it, and no evidence on her body or her gear that she had. The series continues into the mountains that have been watching, long before any of us arrived to watch back.